Welcome to the show. Tonight, Victoria's Premier didn't get the message from the vote on The Voice. She says she's now thinking of letting people who call themselves Aboriginal not pay stamp duty and land tax. But I'll tell you something that might have been missed about the activists actually calling for this. Also tonight, more scandal at Channel 7. Unbelievable. A senior executive using a misleading photo and a threat of potential suicide to scare off an investigation into dodgy expenses. I'll explain later. And a legal first. Parents jailed for the crimes of their son. Plus, the Islamic State warns of strikes against European Cup semi-final, quarter-final matches as a shocking poll shows what British Muslims really want. But first, there are three things, at least, that Foreign Minister Penny Wong has said in the last 24 hours that are so catastrophically stupid that I wonder how anyone can trust her again. Now, you would have heard everyone already attacking what Wong said in a speech last night, making the correct point that she is rewarding terrorism. But I mean, it goes actually much further than that, very disturbingly further. I don't think people have picked up on some of what she actually did say. But of course, yes, rewarding terrorism, that's most obvious. Just 6 months after the Hamas terrorist group started this war with Israel by murdering 1,200 Israelis, raping women, kidnapping about 250 people, some of them still in captivity, more than 100. Here is Wong actually rewarding Hamas for this slaughter and rape of the innocents, offering this prize.
So the international community is now considering the question of Palestinian statehood as a way of building momentum towards a two-state solution. Because the simple truth is that a secure and prosperous future for both Israelis and Palestinians will only come with a two-state solution. Recognition of each other's right to exist. A Palestinian state alongside the State of Israel.
There, a proof that terrorism works. Hamas kills, Wong caves. Oh, can I give you a Palestinian state? But like I say, that is the obvious bit. Condemned by Jewish groups, of course, by the opposition today.
If you come out and say the solution to this is an independent Palestinian state, you're simply rewarding the actions of terrorists.
Hamas is in charge in the Gaza Strip, and a decision like this by Australia, watched from that region, will be seen, I believe, only as emboldening the terrorists.
This is giving a public relations victory to Hamas for what they did on the 7th of October. The timing is all wrong.
In fact, this speech and comments after was so dumb and dangerous and incoherent that I wonder if Wong actually ran her speech by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese before making such a fool of herself, of her government and of her country, and also made herself such a backstabber to Israel, our only democratic ally in the Middle East. Albanese today actually seemed to be running a mile from her, and then from the media after trying to hose down what Wong had said.
Nothing has changed in Australian government position of support for a two-state solution and support for peace, security, stability and prosperity in the Middle East. Thanks very much. Thank you.
And I think you do well.
But it's actually Wong making a big thing about it right now. Right now, that's the issue. But like I say, all that's the obvious stupidity. Unfortunately, it actually goes far deeper to an incredible level. For a start, Wong just isn't listening. Hamas, which runs Gaza, does not actually want Wong's version of peace. It's an Islamist group that forbids any state of Israel. Those Jews. Its charter calls Israel's existence illegal. Its leaders keep confirming Hamas will just keep killing Jews while Israel exists.
المسألة الأولى نحن لا نقبل حل الدولتين.
لازم نقدمها وحنقدمها مرة ثانية وثالثة ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة.
Now, it's not actually that much different with Fatah, which is the other political party which controls the Palestinian Authority that's in charge of the West Bank, the other slab of Palestinian territory. And Fatah has already rejected 2 offers from Israel of a Palestinian state. In 2000 and 2008, the last one would have made it an even bigger state than it is now. So how could Wong's plan do what she claims it will? Bring peace. But it actually gets even dumber. Who'd actually run this Palestinian state that Wong wants? Obvious question, right? Who would run it? Well, Wong tells us, well, of course not Hamas, because, we're right, they are terrorists.
There is no role for Hamas in a future Palestinian state. Any future Palestinian state cannot be in a position to threaten Israel's security and will need a reformed Palestinian Authority.
She wants a Palestinian Authority to run Wong's new Palestinian state? Is she crazy? The Palestinian Authority actually happens to be led by a Jew-hater, Mahmoud Abbas, who last year claimed Hitler didn't murder 6 million Jews because he was anti-Semite. No, it's because Jews are money hungry.
وقال إنه اليهود حارب اليهود لأنهم كانوا يعملون على أساس الربا والمال إنه لا سامية والسامية لا توجد هنا.
In fact, that guy you just saw, Abbas, and his Palestinian Authority, right now spends more than $200 million a year on a pay-for-slay scheme that pays pensions to the families of terrorists killed trying to murder Jews. And it now includes extra payments to families of the Hamas terrorists who were killed after their October 7 attack on Israel, where they were raping and slaughtering, murdering children. And yet we're still not done with Wong's stupidity. I mean, I tell you, I'm surprised more people haven't got on to how incredibly dumb this and ill thought through this is. This Palestinian Authority that Wong's backing, that already runs the West Bank, is so corrupt and so hated by Palestinians that a recent poll showed only 14% wanted it. Only 22% supported the Fatah party of President Abbas. And 72% supported Hamas. And that's exactly why Abbas has banned any election since 2006. So how on earth would Wong impose this hated Palestinian Authority on Palestinians who'd rather have Hamas? And how would she stop Hamas from just shooting its way to power instead, like it did in Gaza? I mean, who'd stop it? You, Penny, and whose army? Even an ABC interviewer did have to ask Wong about this obvious little flaw, and got another idiotic Wong response, a deflection.
Hamas has no place in Gaza.
So how do you remove Hamas from Gaza without a ground operation, in your view?
The question here is international humanitarian law and making sure that Israel complies with international humanitarian law.
So Wong doesn't have a plan to force Hamas to give up control. She just gave another whinge about the only country which has the will to at least try. But her answer was also a con, because Wong doesn't just want Israel to fight by the rules. She wants it to stop fighting full stop. She's just told Israel this week to stop its planned attack on Rafah, which is Hamas's last refuge in Gaza.
We are urging Israel not to proceed with a major ground offensive in Rafah because of the potential loss of civilian life.
So let's sum up this idiotic Wong plan. She's given Hamas a propaganda triumph that makes it even more likely that it will dominate the Palestinian state that she wants, ensuring the new Palestinian nation will be run by terrorists. Yet she has no idea at all how to stop them taking over. But maybe Wong can't really be this stupid, can she? I mean, maybe she doesn't care, just doesn't care about Israel and peace. Maybe what she's really doing here is sucking up to the Muslim voters in Labor seats in Sydney's West, trying to stop them from voting instead for the very anti-Israel Greens and new Muslim independents. When, after all, you've got pro-Palestinian protests already hounding the Prime Minister, again today. So is that why she's also today reposted Albanese's end of Ramadan greeting to Muslims? Maybe that is really Wong's plan. Not a peace plan for the Middle East, but a peace plan for Western Sydney. And Israel will just have to pay the price. Joining me now is Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer, and Liberal MP Garth Hamilton. Michael, what do you think Penny Wong is up to?
Well, I think Penny Wong has been foolish and is inept. And clearly, Andrew, you're absolutely correct. This is about internal ALP politics. It's got nothing to do with solving the problems in Israel, and Gaza, as if Australia could do that in any event. It's just a joke. It's very much focused about what's going on inside the Labor Party, particularly the Victorian Labor Party that has a state conference coming up, and also, of course, the New South Wales Party. And the reason I say that this is foolish is that it's not going to achieve the outcome they want. I mean, unfortunately, in those Western Sydney seats, if you were to take a poll, it would not surprise me to see the majority of the people there supporting Hamas. I mean, the reality is that the chant, the river to the sea, is the chant that's the dominant chant in those communities. I don't hear people out there calling for a two-state solution. In fact, the majority of people in those seats wouldn't support a two-state solution. This is why this is a very, very foolish policy that she's adopted. In addition, it risks alienating the rest of the community. I mean, you've got to remember the Green vote in, say, what's his name? Tony Burke's seat was less than the national average. I think in the energy minister's seat, it was around 6%, half the national average. So the fact of the matter is they're really not playing to the majority in their electorates in any event, and they risk losing the majority of the Australian population. This is another political strategy like The Voice.
Garth Hamilton, I've heard people today say, well, look, Anthony Albanese is backed Penny Wong today. I'm not so sure. That press conference, he cut it quite short. He seemed to be playing it down. Nothing's changed, nothing's changed. Is Penny Wong running her own foreign policy, as I suggested on Monday, or are they just playing good cop, bad cop?
Isn't it sad to see Australia's foreign policy being dictated by a factional rift in the Australian Labor Party over something so important? And look, Andrew, I don't think I've ever been so disgusted in this government as to what we've seen today. You're right, Michael is right, this is inept. There is stupidity in the thought process that goes into this. This is also one of the most cold-blooded calculations that we could possibly see from an Australian government, to completely turn our back on our Israeli friends at a time, Andrew, when there are still Israeli hostages being held in terrible situations, at a time where the Hamas are still continuing to threaten further aggression against Israel. Our friends are in need, and this is the position of Australia. Our position is to dangle a reward in front of those who have committed this. I'm not surprised that Labor is split. There are a lot of good people in the Labor Party. Unfortunately, what they're allowing is this ideology to tear them and Australia apart, and it's led us down a very, very dangerous path.
Well, I have to pick up on that, Michael. The Labor right wing has long had a proud history of supporting Israel, right? I've seen it, Israeli meetings, worshipping Bob Hawke, for instance. Bill Shorten was very strong. Where are the Labor right people, the defenders of Israel now? I'm not hearing from them. And I've got to ask you, I mean, the question I just asked Garth, do you think that Penny Wong is on a frolic of her own, dictating to Albanese, seems all at sea with foreign affairs? Is it her policies, her left-wing policies? And if it's her left-wing policies, where is the right?
Well, first response is, remember, Albanese is from the left. I mean, let's just not beat around the bush. You're dealing with somebody that, if he wasn't Prime Minister, would probably be out there throwing bombs at the direction of whoever the Prime Minister was on this very issue himself. That's been his history. He's been able to sort of grow in the job, or at least moderate some of his views in the job, because that's what he requires to keep the majority of Australians on side. But he is from the left. And to answer your question about the right, there are people in the right that are fighting against this policy, but they're a minority. We've long passed the days when the right, and particularly the New South Wales right, was the dominant driver of policies in this country. It's been 20 years since you could argue that position, and that's why we've had two prime ministers
Michael,
from the left.
Name one figure on the Labor right who has publicly stood up and challenged this tidal wave of Hamas, pro-Hamas propaganda and said Labor is on the wrong track here.
There are many people. There's many people. Michael Eason, for example, a former Secretary of the Labor Council, the position I took, he's running a group that's supporting, Labor for Israel, and he's done work behind the scenes. And there's many people in the Labor Party, they are not the dominant group.
Can't wait to have them come on the show. They're not the dominant group.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, look. No, the point is they're not making the fuss. But Garth, the other thing I wonder about this government is why it keeps uncritically repeating Hamas propaganda, particularly the Hamas figures on the deaths in Gaza, when the claims, for instance, that 2/3 of the dead are children have been debunked or challenged by a US think tank, which shows that, yes, indeed, media reports do claim that 63% of the dead are children, but the actual records kept by the Gaza's own Ministry of Health, which is still Hamas run, says 15% are children, and men, including Hamas terrorists, actually make up more than half the dead, which suggests, of course, that Israel is much more careful to avoid killing civilians than you think from the way that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese have been talking this week.
Well, look, when we talk about these figures, the first thing we should always say, every one of these deaths is the responsibility of Hamas. They started this war. They've chosen how this war is going to be conducted from behind their own human shields of their own people, and they've refused ceasefire all the way through. So the first thing we should always say, every one of these deaths is the responsibility of Hamas, and they've brought it upon themselves, and that's a terrible thing to say. But can I ask you, how confident are we in those numbers, for example, coming out of the Ukraine? Why don't we hear the same sort of numbers coming out of there? Isn't it interesting that the fog of war is a reasonable excuse for us not to hear those numbers in one field of war, but in a highly politicised conflict where one side has clearly chosen, and the left side of politics has clearly chosen who they side with, these numbers are being positioned as if they are absolutes. We're talking about an area, and Andrew, I know you were over there recently, I was too, the complete chaos and fog of war that exists in these situations, and we're led to believe that these numbers are exact. And when they're being used to push a political case, I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to have some apprehension and to pull back just a little bit. And I go back again, why is it we're not hearing the similar sort of numbers out of the Ukraine? The reason is, correct. I'm pretty sure, because they don't know.
Well, look, I find it incredible that people aren't realising it's an analogous right now to accepting the word of Dr. Goebbels in World War II about what's really going on in Nazi Germany during the war, and reporting it uncritically as true. That is exactly what's happening with Hamas, a terrorist group that will kill its rivals in Gaza. Just finally, Michael, you've already made the point that Labor might be turning off people who are not Labor voters on its position on Israel. But I wonder, what danger is it really in some of these Western Sydney seats? Because, for instance, Tony Burke's seat you mentioned, 25% Muslim vote. Is there any danger of seats like that falling? I mean, is it actually panicking over nothing, sacrificing Israel to appease a threat that doesn't actually exist?
Look, I think that's true, Andrew, and I think if you're cold and rational about this, where would these people actually go? Are they going to vote for the Greens? The point you just made. I mean, on many of their social issues, they would run a million miles from the Greens. So really, they've really got no alternative other than not to vote in an election. But I don't think that's what it's about. It's not the seats themselves. It's internal Labor Party. The factions itself have adopted this position. And, as the right has declined and union influence in the right, you've got the left of the ALP ALP that's pushing these positions. It's the same as the rallies that you see. The majority of Australians aren't out there protesting for Hamas. It is a fringe group, and unfortunately that fringe group is dominant within sections of the ALP, and that's the problem. They're appealing to them.
Garth Hamilton, Michael Costa, thank you both so much for your time. I thought 60% of Australians voted last year against apartheid in the voice vote. Yet Jill Gallagher is an Aboriginal bureaucrat, former Treaty Advancement Commissioner in Victoria. I didn't even know we had them, but there they go. Says a treaty now being negotiated between Aborigines and the Victorian government must exempt Aborigines from paying land taxes, stamp duty, and council rates and a whole lot of other things. And we should also give people identifying as Aboriginal interest-free loans for homes. It's all extraordinary, yet Victorian Labor Premier Jacinta Allen says, well, these are indeed things that she will negotiate in a future treaty.
This and a whole range of other matters will be put on the table for negotiations. I'm not in a position today to rule anything in or out about what might be considered through those treaty negotiations.
I'm just stunned by that, but I guess we should actually thank Gallagher, first of all, for proving that you're going to get an endless gimme from this disastrous victim mentality of the Aboriginal industry. It's the standard operating procedure. Now, apparently the more than $40 billion a year that Australian taxpayers already spend on Aborigines is still not enough, nor are the grants of native title land. Gallagher says, no, Aborigines also need these tax breaks now to finally let Aborigines create wealth.
My mother, my grandmother, my great-grandfather never had an opportunity to create wealth so they can pass it on to their families. None of our families had that opportunity.
Can that be true? In fact, Australia is so rich with opportunities, including for Aborigines, that wave after wave of immigrants have come here and done well. Jewish refugees who came with nothing, immigrants fleeing poverty in southern Italy, boat people from Vietnam with just the clothes on their back. And there was something else about Gallagher's answer there, claiming her mother's line couldn't create wealth, that struck me, and which was confirmed just by looking at him. I mean, Gallagher clearly also has white ancestors. In fact, her father was of Irish descent. Didn't they at least have this same chance as other Australians to create wealth? So does Gallagher qualify for the whole tax holiday she's demanding for Aborigines, or only get half in acknowledgement of her Irish descent? Joining me is Warren Mundine, one of the leaders of the No campaign against the Voice, a former national president of the Labor Party, former advisor to 2 Liberal Prime Ministers, specifically on how to create wealth for Aboriginal Australia. Warren Mundine, always great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
You're a man of means. I'm sure you didn't get it from big inheritances. How did you become wealthy enough compared to a lot of Australians? Did you need these tax holidays?
Well, look, your viewers are going to have to put their fingers in their ears because I'm going to use a 4-letter word. It's called work. My grandparents brought their own house back in the 1930s, and my parents brought their house in the 1940s. I brought my house in the 1970s, and my children have brought their house in the noughties. So, and one of my grandchildren is saving her money to get her house. So we've got 5 generations of Aboriginal people who have owned their own house, got educations, got jobs, and worked from it. I live in Sydney because I'm an economic refugee. My parents come from the bush. They were dirt poor, hard workers, but they still scraped up money to buy a house. And it wasn't a big house. It was only 4 rooms. Mum and Dad got 1 room. The girls, my sisters, got 1 room. Then you had a bathroom and a toilet. And then you had the kitchen. Us boys slept on the veranda. And then my father eventually enclosed that veranda, and our grandparents come and lived with us when they got old and invalids. And this is how we grew up. My dad would get up in the morning at 5 a.m. My mum would get up with him. They'd make breakfast. They'd prepare lunches. and they'd get us off to school and my older siblings, of course, to work, you know, and we did a lot of this stuff. In fact, 3 of my sisters worked in banks. Can you imagine women working in a bank, let alone Aboriginal women working in banks in the 1950s, 60s?
Absolutely. Then you get, but your story, right, cuts right across this narrative by this woman that Aborigines were prevented from collecting, you know, assets and passing on wealth to their children. They now need property taxes for anyone claiming to have some Aboriginal ancestors. It could be a Bruce Basco, for all I know. What's your response to that?
It's a brain fart. It is not going to do one thing for Aboriginal people. Land tax, I don't know very many white people who pay land tax. You have to have a lot of property and you have to have commercial property to pay for land tax. And there's so many exemptions for other things like agricultural work and that you get. So I don't know how many Aboriginals are going to be helped, you know, except, you know, when I worked it out, I think I could, you know, do quite well out of this. So I'm starting to cotton on to this idea, you know, that I could get all these freebies. And
look, I think I'm going to have to cut this interview very quickly.
Yeah, we're having a joke because it is not going to stop crime. It's not going to stop deaths in custody. It is not going to get kids to school. It is not going to get parents into jobs. It is not going to get housing. It is not going to get all the things and expand our lives. All it is a bunch of elites who are quite frankly, unrepresentative because they only had 7% of the vote.
I think that's right. Oh, that's exactly right too. This whole separatist agenda, mate. I thought you killed it off. I thought you killed it off with the Voice vote, but obviously it still exists. Some people can't get over the that business model. Warren Medina, I've got to go. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Loved your story. Thank you very much. After the break, even more scandals at Channel 7 on top of what it got up to in the Bruce Lehrmann case. And how do you know how left-wing the ABC really is? Well, look at what it's saying about the Prime Minister's new Governor-General. This is too funny. How telling is this? The ABC coming out all guns blazing to defend the Prime Minister's new pick for our Governor-General. Sam Mostyn, the leftist activist and former Climate Council chairman. What does it say that Conservatives, me included, have widely attacked Mostyn's appointment? The Liberals have also been very lukewarm about it, pointing out she's a Labor insider. But the ABC, supposedly impartial because of taxpayer funding, now defending it. Not a word of criticism of Mostyn, just frantic defence from Annabel Crabb, from Virginia Trioli, a friend of Mostyn's, of course, and also of the frequent flyer left. And Julia Baird left us all, and all in defence of one of their own. Joining me is Sophie Ellsworth, media writer of the Australian newspaper. Sophie, have you heard a word of criticism from someone in the ABC of Mostyn's appointment to Governor-General? Someone who's essentially been a professional activist of the left.
Well, Andrew, I always stand to be corrected in case there's some obscure show on the ABC where perhaps there was. But the short answer is no, I cannot find this, not prominently anywhere on the ABC, on their social media or so forth. It was really interesting, though, Andrew, that these 3 women came out basically defending Sam Mostyn, and it's always one side. The ABC's views seem to always skew one side. Now, you could argue perhaps that happens at commercial outlets, but we are not funded by the taxpayers, and this is where the ABC lets down people. I noticed that Virginia Trioli wrote in her piece, Andrew, that her and Sam Mostyn bonded over something like equality and equity. She was, pontificating about her great friendship with Sam Mostyn, and also point out that Annabel Crabb also wrote in her piece that Sam Mostyn's piece, which I wrote, talking about how she was praising Peter Fitzsimons for his passionate advocacy of the Republic, was something that got criticism. Well, shouldn't it? She's the Governor-General, for heaven's sake.
Should. Well, the Governor-General is supposed to be pledging personal loyalty to the King. I mean, seriously, is she crossing her fingers when she does that? So what does it say about the ABC bias that its big stars are cheering a Governor-General the Conservatives criticise. Doesn't it exactly make my point? And by the way, isn't it amazing how Sam Mostyn looks exactly like those three women in Views? It should fit right into their dinner table parties.
Well, that's right, Andrew, and I just was waiting for someone conservative at the ABC to say perhaps this is a problematic appointment, perhaps pointing out some of Sam Mostyn's flaws, because you could argue she was prolific on social media. She never shied away from voicing her, campaigning for the climate and gender issues, and that's all well and good. But when you're in that Governor-General role, I don't think people would want people appointed to that role to be partisan.
No, bite your tongue. The whole point, the main point of this Governor-Generalship is to be the neutral umpire that everyone can trust to do the right thing if there's a constitutional crisis and, God forbid, the Prime Minister has to be sacked, something like that. That's what it's just absolutely essential. But to Channel 7, we've talked about it. It's been under huge fire after being accused by former Spotlight producer Taylor Albach of paying for drugs and prostitutes for Bruce Lehrmann to get an exclusive interview from him about the Brittany Higgins rape claim against him. Lehrmann, of course, denies rape, and a judge on Monday will say what he thinks really happened, but who knows. But now, Sophie, new claims about Channel 7's commercial director, the outgoing one is just quitting, Bruce McWilliam, and how he tried to stop a journalist who was investigating unproven allegations against Seven's super producer Michael Pell, allegations about the use of freebies, including by people not even employed by Seven. What's the story?
Well, the SMH had 3 pages on this today, but basically in a nutshell, a reporter who used to work at The Age and SMH did some investigating to look into whether there was an investigation into misuse of spending at this Channel 7 Sunrise program. And when Zoe Samios made those inquiries, including, allegations against Michael Pell, she was met with some pretty hostile responses from Bruce McWilliam, who is known in the industry for his colourful emails, and then this photo emerged of Michael Pell injured, in an image, and it was claimed that she was the cause of some of this, that he was hurting himself because of what she was reporting. Now, there's all allegations flying around here of when the photo was taken, what purpose was the photo used for, and so forth. But in short, Andrew, this is really a sorry saga in the way Seven have dealt with some of their issues over the past. And sometimes in the media, Andrew, you can deal with people when there's a serious story at hand, as you know. You deal with comms people and they can be very fair. They understand what you're doing. But at other times, they can be very aggressive. And the SMH really went extensively into some of the emails. They published some of them, even one today that said off the record by Bruce McWilliam. They published some of his comments. So this is getting very, very messy with a lot of media outlets attacking each other at the moment, Andrew.
And apparently that photo accusing the journalist of creating that injury might have been taken before she made any inquiries, might have been totally unrelated, which, if that's true, is a little bit off, I think. Sophie Ellsworth, thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, should parents be jailed for raising evil children, killer children? 2 have just made history for exactly that. For the first time ever, this is history. An American court has jailed parents for the crimes of their child. American Ethan Crumley was 15 when he killed 4 fellow students in a school in Michigan who just seemed pretty or happier than him. He killed them with a gun bought by his parents. More than that, his mother had ignored appeals from her son for help, his complaints that he was seeing voices, feeling paranoid, that she was leaving him alone, please help. And now those parents have been jailed for at least 10 years, despite their apologies and claims of innocence.
The truth has not been told. You know that what my son did, I was not aware of.
If there's anything the general public can take away from this, is that this could happen to you too.
Joining me, Liberal Senator Claire Chandler and Evelyn Ray, Sky News presenter and regular commentator on this show. Claire, is this something that you'd like to see a bit more of? Is it something that perhaps we should bring to Australia, jailing parents for raising monsters, or is it a step too far?
Oh, look, I think it's an interesting question, Andrew, and I always come back to the point of whether or not it's appropriate to attribute criminal responsibility in these situations. And look, I'm not entirely across the facts of the case that you've just outlined there, but broadly speaking, I mean, yes, parents should be taking responsibility for raising their children and raising good children. I think that's what all parents want to do. But the question of whether or not the parents are actively, egging on their children to undertake some of these heinous crimes is something that should rightly be determined by a court of law. Like I say, I'm not entirely across exactly how those facts might have played out in this case, but it's certainly an interesting question, isn't it?
Evelyn Ray, in principle?
I think what's important to remember here is that nobody should be punished for crimes that they haven't committed. But I guess in this instance, there are a lot of questions as to whether this thing falls in the category of negligence and perhaps whether it's failure to look after your child and or the firearm that the parents purchased that the child took. So, similarly to dog ownership, if I have a dangerous dog, I'm responsible for restraining that dog and for protecting the public against it. And if I fail to do that, the burden of responsibility falls on my shoulders. So I think the logical question here is whether that falls in that category. I mean, if the parents are being trialled for the murders themselves, I would probably say that's morally wrong because they're not responsible. But if it falls into the category of like what I mentioned before with the specifics, then it is a good question to ask, because I think parents need and ought to be more responsible for the children and how they're raising their children and the danger that the children they're raising presents to society.
Yeah, well, here it's a question of neglect, not paying attention to the ticking of a time bomb. Claire, to a case you've been following closely, it's being heard this week in the federal court. As I said last night, the federal court's being asked to decide what a woman really is. After I didn't know we had that confusion after thousands of years. Roxanne Tickle was born male, had gender reassignment surgery, now designated as female on the birth certificate, now claims too that discriminated against on the grounds of gender identity by the Giggles for Girls app, and its owner Sal Grover refused to let Tickle join the group that she created, Safe Space for Women, Born Women. How important is this case?
I think this case, Andrew, is incredibly important for Australian women and for Australia generally. This case is going to decide fundamentally how the issue of rights that are attached to gender identity interact with the rights that attach to biological sex. And more broadly than that, I think it's pretty crazy that in 2024, an Australian woman, Sal Grover, is having to go to a court of law to find out whether or not women in Australia do have the right to access single-sex services and spaces. I mean, this is an issue I've been concerned about for many, many years now, and I've always feared that it would be a court that would have to decide these things, so it will be very interesting to see what happens. But Sal is an absolute fighter, and she's fighting a very important cause here, and I think all Australians, particularly Australian women and girls, will be looking very carefully at what happens here.
And you know what bothers me about cases like this, Evelyn, is that the process is the punishment, because once you're taken to court, you're up for tens and tens and tens of thousands of dollars of costs. You've got the worry, the sleepless nights, the weeks and weeks of preparation. Even if you win, you feel like you've been done, dragged through the ringer. I mean, it's just terrible.
It absolutely is. And I mean, often people pull out before we actually get tangible results because the process, like you mentioned, is the punishment, and it is legally, insane what we have to go through, financially insane what people have to go through. But, this is such an incredibly important case. Case law in Australia is such a huge component to our legal system, and the precedent that this sets will literally determine the world, the nation that we leave for our daughters and essentially our granddaughters. It's a huge thing. I honestly hope and pray that logic and reason leads to the right conclusion with this. But I mean, who would have thought that what a 5-year-old could determine in a classroom only about 2 years ago is something that we now even have to debate in a high court? No. I mean, what a time to be alive.
Oh, gosh. Claire, I mentioned last night 2 new studies in Europe warning against giving puberty blockers to children who think they're transgender, right? These studies were saying, well, most children actually grow out of it, 2/3 do. And those who insist that they're in the wrong body often have underlying issues to do with unhappy families or whatever, or mental issues or something. Now the National Association of Practicing Psychiatrists here in Australia is sounding the same warning here. It's just urged this afternoon the Prime Minister to hold a review here into what gender clinics are doing to children. Would you back that?
Look, absolutely, Andrew. I've been saying for quite some time now that we need a full independent review into the gender industry in this country, because internationally, experts have been sounding the bell on these practices for years and years now, and Australia is falling further and further behind because all of these treatment practices are operating under the cover of darkness. So it's time for us to shed a light on what's happening in the gender industry in Australia. Absolutely.
Evelyn Ray, high time, I would have thought. I mean, the procedures are so drastic to these children. We should have full information about what's really happening.
Incredibly true. I mean, I can't get a tattoo, but you know what I can do? If I'm under 18, I can cut my breasts off in the name of tolerance. Like, riddle me that one. Adults need to stop conducting social experiments on children. It's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. I thought our job was to protect children from those things, and perhaps we should get back to the very basics and actually start doing that.
Claire Chandler, Evelyn Ray, thank you both for your time. After the break, an Islamist group threatens to attack the Champions League quarter-finals in Europe next week. And at the same time, Britain is rocked by a new poll of what British Muslims really do think of terrorists. Europe's Champions League quarter-finals are being played with some big games next week in Spain. The security suddenly went up after a threat by the Islamic State to hit them, like it hit that Moscow theatre last month. Just to underline the problem, though, that Europe has made for itself, there's a new poll of British Muslims. It's found that nearly half support the Hamas terrorist group. Nearly half. The group that slaughtered 1,200 Israelis last October 7. And only 1 in 4 think Hamas actually committed atrocities that day. Joining me from London is Patrick Christie's star host of GB News. Patrick, I mean, this is all rather concerning. First of all, how serious have the Islamic State's threats been taken?
Well, the Islamic State threats have not been taken as seriously in Britain as they have actually in Spain. Spain put thousands of extra police officers on the street, whereas over here in Britain, we very much adopted a live and let die approach, I think, really, although thankfully everything did go off without a hitch. The problem is that we have so many homegrown terrorists and so many homegrown people on a terror watch list, Andrew, that really, when Islamic State put a poster out with pictures of football grounds and the slogan "Kill them all," what they are doing is they're issuing a call to arms for any lunatic that might already be here. They don't really have to continue to import the problem like maybe they've done in other European countries. But as you alluded to, it's not hard to see why when you look at some opinion polling taking place within the British Muslim community that shows massive, overwhelming support at times for Hamas, a banned terrorist organisation, especially amongst, and this is concerning, the younger generation. So 18 to 34-year-olds, that cohort of British Muslims are the most radical and the most extreme. Only 26% of them thought that Hamas actually committed rape and murder on October the 7th. If I also look at some of the other concerning aspects of this poll that are not terror-related but religion-related, 52% think it should be illegal to show a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. That is a blasphemy law in Britain. 32% openly want Sharia law for Britain. Those numbers are going to rise as the population rises. It raises questions, Andrew, as to whether or not the religion of peace does always really come in peace.
Yeah, but it also raises another question that disturbs me that you've touched on there, Patrick, because we saw the same results in a poll, I think it was January this year in France, a big poll of French Muslims. There's 6 million there, showing again something like 10% of support of extremist groups. Plus, of course, the young being more radical than the older people. And that goes right across this assumption, oh, look, don't worry about the ones we're bringing in. The kids will learn to adapt and soon you won't notice the difference. That's not the case in France. And in here, in this particular survey, you got 46% of younger Muslims actually wanted a Muslim political party set up, and 43%, nearly half, wanted to make Britain an Islamic state. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, and we hear a lot, don't we, about, oh, multiculturalism has failed. I actually think that's very, very disrespectful to a lot of other cultures that have come to Britain and Europe and completely assimilated. I think it is actually a specific problem with pockets of the Islamic faith and not wanting to assimilate. We can see it borne out time and time again as a result of these polls. There are some other things, you know, like the overwhelming majority of them want halal food to be compulsory in schools and hospitals. People might think that's less concerning, but again, I suppose it maybe does indicate no real desire to assimilate there. The stats here are very, very stark. They also are in favour in the round of removing MPs who do not share their views when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So an increased militancy and an increased politicisation of the Islamic faith in Britain. If only someone could have seen this coming.
Yeah, well, it really does worry me. Again, like I say, this lazy assumption that there's going to be assimilation. The point is, of course, and we're seeing, I think, the same in Australia now, recent surveys showing young people generally, not just Muslim, lacking a sense of feeling that this is really their country. We're having this massive intake of immigrants from very different cultures at times, at a time when Western societies are saying how hateful they are. Why would anyone want to pledge loyalty to, like Britain? You're a racist, genocidal country with a shameful history on slavery. You've got to tear down portraits of old English people from the past, like you're getting an Oxford's Oriel College at the moment, or a statue in Birmingham, wherever it was. This is the problem, isn't it? People want to feel part of something bigger and better than themselves, and the Western cultures aren't offering it to them, or they're actually telling them, look elsewhere.
Yeah, no, indeed, we have a problem on multiple fronts. So if people do ultimately feel as though they're serving a higher power, i.e. their God, and that has complete supremacy over everything else, that's very difficult to combat. We also have that internal kind of demolition, really, of what it is to be British and a sense of nationhood. Nothing to cling on to there. Undermining and teaching that everything that we've done is bad. No, in any way, attempt whatsoever to force some kind of assimilation. So kind of almost a simping, really, to other cultures. But the mindset now of young people, not just British Muslims, but young people in general, we're seeing groups like radical climate actors teaming up with, I would argue, really quite extreme Palestinian activist groups to commit now just acts of vandalism on the streets and take on political parties. There is a problem with the younger generation here in Britain. And that is because we're not actually selling them a vision. And you look around, you look at all our major cities and towns, and you are seeing, really, the destruction of any kind of national identity whatsoever. Is it any surprise, really, then, when they rebel and they are drawn maybe to more radical actors, especially with the implication as well that TikTok and social media has? We have massive amounts of radical preachers on TikTok poisoning young minds, and as well, huge increases in the number of converts to the Islamic faith from the young, white British community. It really is on the march, Andrew.
I'm afraid it is, Patrick. Patrick Christys, thank you so much indeed for your time. And here's another worry, you know, the European Court of Human Rights, a worry for Europe, has just ruled that Switzerland hasn't been doing enough to fight global warming. And that's an attack on the human rights of elderly women who are particularly vulnerable, it says, to heat waves linked to global warming. And what's crazy about that is, what's a human rights court doing, adjudicating on science? And secondly, these women actually be much more likely to die from cold, according to the Lancet study last year. 10 times more likely to die from cold. Seriously. That's it from me. Coming up next, Sharry Markson. Good night.